Let's turn to a Trinitarian response to biblical Unitarianism. My name is Ariel ben-Lyman, HaNaviy. We are looking at biblicalunitarian.com's website, which is a website about God and his son, Jesus Christ. And we've been discussing the passage out of the book of Psalm, chapter 45, verse 6, "Your throne, O God, will last forever," from their perspective. So let's read the passage out of the NIV as they have it posted to their website. "Your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom," out of the NIV. Notice on the screen that their explanation of the verse is quoted. They remind us that it's quoted in the book of Hebrews, chapter 1, verse 8. And so their explanation is found there. And so indeed, let's turn to their explanation and just remind ourselves what the non-Trinitarian perspective on this verse is. And then I'm going to try and finish this tonight. If I don't, it'll only go into one more week. But I think we're getting the idea from a non-Unitarian perspective of why I believe that this verse is best understood as referring to Yeshua and his deity. But here's what they have to say. They make a case that the translation of the wording, the translation of the verse where it says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever," that translation is found in most standard English translations and most Trinitarian sounding Christian translations, is not the best translation. They say it's an option. It is an optional translation. But they opt for a translation that reads something like, "Your throne is God forever." That first clause about "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." Instead of using what we've come to know as the vocative, where we address someone directly, they opt for what's known as the nominative, which is possible. "Your throne is God forever," meaning, and this is their explanation, this is their website, biblicalunitarian.com. This means that God is the authority, the throne of the king, and the king reigns with the authority of God. This king, and by extension the Messiah, the true king of Israel, has been specially anointed by God. So their perspective is that the psalmist, as well as the writer to the book of Hebrews, was not declaring Jesus as God when he says, "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." Instead, if we say "Your throne is God forever," we're simply saying your authority is from God, that God has granted you, and therefore that's why you are a righteous king, etc., etc. So let's remind ourselves what the passages say in Hebrew and in Greek, and begin to look once more at some of the structural analysis, finishing up the verse translations. We dead ended last week at the Jehovah's Witnesses. We'll pick up again. But first I want to read the English, then the Hebrew, then the Greek. So this is NASB in front of you. "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever." The phrase "O God" is what is known as vocative, VOCATIVE. I'll show a little chart on the screen here that explains the difference between vocative and nominative in a moment. But I'm just making you aware that your translator is going to display his bias to the original Hebrew or Greek based on the way he understands the context of any given passage and the message that's trying to be conveyed by the original writer, which we're going to find out in the end, if we can get to it tonight. The final authority is really what God gave to the biblical writer at the time, and the context of the way they were being shown the revelation of whatever it is they were to write. It really doesn't matter so much what we later translators of the Bible have to say. In the end, God's word is authoritative in the sense that what God gave to the original writer and the context that was driving what they saw is what should be the final say. You'd be surprised how much translators wiggle there around that. But "Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom." So there are two parts to this verse that are of interest to us from the original languages. One is the clause "O God." What does that look like in the Hebrew and the Greek? And then lastly, notice that this particular translation out of the NSB says, "A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom." We're going to find that there are other translations that don't say "your kingdom." There are other translations that say "his kingdom," which changes the perspective of who is the writer addressing, right? If you're addressing God, then we would say the scepter of your kingdom, first person. You, O God, the kingdom of you, right? O God. But if it says the scepter of his kingdom, but we just got through addressing God, Doesn't that sound a little bit odd? Sounds like we suddenly jump into third person. All right, let me show you the Hebrew just real quick. The Hebrew says, Kisacha Elohim Olam Ve'ed, the first clause, Kisacha, the throne of you, or your throne, Elohim, God, Olam Ve'ed, forever and ever. And the is, the verb, is supplied by context. Kisacha Elohim Olam Ve'ed, that's the first clause. And notice the very first word over here is Kisacha, is the Hebrew construct of a noun plus the suffix indicating possession, the throne of you, or we smooth it out in English by saying your. So your throne, not his throne. That would be a different word, a different way to be expressed in Hebrew. But notice the verse continues by saying, Shevet mishor shevet malchutecha. And so over here at the very end of the verse in Hebrew, malchutecha is the same construction, noun plus the personal pronoun indicating the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out by saying your kingdom. If it said malchuto instead of malchutecha, then it would be the kingdom of his, or we smooth it out by saying his kingdom. But notice it doesn't say Shevet Malchuto. It says Shevet Malchutecha. What does that mean? It means the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out by saying your kingdom, the one that he possesses. Okay, so that's the Hebrew. Let's look at Hebrews as it's taken this verse out of the book of Psalms and rendered it. This is Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8. And in the context, we're jumping into context, but notice that the writer to the book of Hebrews signals who he's referring to by saying, but of the Son. It's a contrast between speaking of the angels and of the Son. If we were to back up a verse, we would say, and of the angels, he says in verse 7, who makes his angels winds and his ministers a flame of fire. And then contrast, but of the Son, he says, and the he is God, God the Father. Speaking of the angels in verse 7, and now speaking of the Son, the writer to the book of Hebrews says, but of the Son, he says. And then we have our quote from the book of Psalms. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever, and the righteous scepter is the scepter of, and we have his kingdom again, right? Notice in earlier, let me pull it up, the scepter of your kingdom. Notice a slight difference. In the same Bible translation, NASB, from the Hebrew, we had the scepter of your kingdom from the Hebrew of Malchutecha. And now in the Greek, or the book of Hebrews, we have the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. Well, why does it say his kingdom? We still have the your throne, O God, right? The vocative there. Let's look at the Greek and see if we can glean any details from there. The Greek says pros deton huion. That's but of the Son. Now we have our clause ha thronasu ha theos. Ace ton iona to ionas kai. Let me pause between the clauses. First clause, pros deton huion, but of the Son, he says. And then we have our quote from starting in the book of Psalms, starting right there. Ha thronos su, the throne of you, ha theos, O God. Ace is ton iona, the ages of the ages. Iona to ionas. That's the first basic clause. The throne of you, O God, is forever and ever, or is from the ages to the ages. We could render it that way. The ionas, literally ages, or something to that effect. We just rendered it as from forever to forever, or is forever and ever, like it said in the Hebrew, olam ve'ed. But hathronasu, the throne of you, this particular Greek word, right? Let's see if I can highlight it. There we go. That particular Greek word, hathronasu, the throne of you. So your throne. Ha theos, the next phrase there in the Greek, ha thronos, ha theos, O God, or the God, or just God. It shows up as a vocative in the lexiconic dictionaries that we pull up. But in its most normative sense, like in the translation from the Septuagint, which we'll see here in a moment, it doesn't have to be vocative. It's just a standard nominative, just a standard noun, right? It can be rendered as the God. or we take out the word the and just render it as God. So your throne, God. But it continues. Eistan iona tu ionas kai hechrabdas tes euthu tetas chrabdas tes basileas su. And this final phrase down at the bottom, let me highlight it for you. Tes basileas su, the kingdom of you, or we smooth it out in our translations as your kingdom. Notice this corresponds with the English of his kingdom, the kingdom of him. I should have said your kingdom. The kingdom of him, tes basileas su, the kingdom that is his, the scepter of his kingdom. Now, this is in contrast to some other translations, which we're going to see here in a moment, that say your kingdom instead of his kingdom. It seems like it changes the person. All right, so I don't want to get too deep into that portion of the Greek right just yet. Let's keep looking at the structural analysis. Well, you know what? Now is a good time to look into the Greek. I apologize. I actually do want to look at the Greek right now. Let me blow that up just a little bit more for us. I think maybe that should be good. Look at these renderings from the Greek. Let's just highlight using these two versions. The NAS 27 and UBS4 variants has this final clause, and it shows it using variant form. Tes basileas autou /su. Why would we have two different options for the final wording? Just so you know, I'll show this to you in the Byzantine majority text. As you know, there's three really important manuscript families that are out there, of which two are the maybe what we might call the primary, and a third one which is one that we also need to be aware of, but it isn't one of the primaries. It's more of a minority, just because of how many manuscripts have survived time. And the manuscripts I'm talking about from age, from the oldest going up to the more current of the three, are the Sinaiticus, which is symbolized by the letter Aleph in the Hebrew. So Sinaiticus is one of the older manuscripts. And to that, so that's 4th century. Along with that, we also have what's known as the Vaticanus, which is signified by the letter B, the symbol that's given to these particular codices. So symbol B, I believe, is Vaticanus. And then that's also 4th century. And then along with that, Alexandrinus. And then Vaticanus is symbolized by the letter A. Let's try it one more time. I'm going to put a little graphic on the screen so that I'm not getting confused. So we have Sinaiticus, then we have Alexandrinus, then we have Vaticanus. I believe that's the order in which they show up from oldest to newest. But germane to our study is that when you have a modern Bible translation such as KJV or NASB or ESV or whatever version you have, they pull from these manuscripts, and if there's a variant in the manuscript, that's going to cause your translator to use a different word when he translates it into English. So there's the a translation that pulls from a manuscript that reads Tes basileas su, and then there's the translation, let me go up earlier, that reads from a manuscript that says Tes basileas autou. And the difference that impacts us, let me scroll to the bottom of this particular tool. The impact is that NASB, using one of the older manuscripts, ends up with scepter of his kingdom, but KJV, using one of the newer transcripts, says scepter of your kingdom, or thy kingdom, the kingdom of his. The Tes basileas su is the thy kingdom, and the Tes basileas autou is the his kingdom, the kingdom of him. And I mentioned last week a little bit that this is kind of a minor difference, but in the end, we're going to find that it can have really a big significance, a big discussion and impact on whether or not the writer to the book of Hebrews is addressing the Son or whether he's addressing God. Because notice in the NASB it says, but of the Son he says, your throne, God, is forever. Sounds like he's talking to the Son. But then he says, the scepter, the righteous scepter is the scepter of his kingdom. It sounds like it's talking to the Son, but the opponents might say that it's actually talking to God himself. Comparatively, when we look at the KJV, but of the Son, he says, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of thy kingdom. It sounds like we're still addressing the Son when we use two thys in the quote, thy throne and thy kingdom, is the point I'm trying to make. And the original Hebrew was your and your. So the original Hebrew doesn't have your and his, like the writer to the book of Hebrews pulls from the NESB. In other words, it doesn't use the word autou. The original Greek from the Septuagint, which we're going to definitely have to look at. In fact, let's do it right now. Find my Septuagint rendering. Apologize, my links changed over in the middle of the week. The Septuagint reference that I was used to referencing suddenly died. It disappeared. So I don't know what happened. The website went belly up or something. But so I'm going to use a different tool. We have the Septuagint of Psalm 45:6, which is the rendering of the Greek translation into Hebrew, from the Hebrew translation into Greek in the 200 years before Yeshua showed up on the scene. And notice it says, Hathronas su, Hatheas eistan, Iona tu, Ionas chabdas, Euthu tetas, he chabdas tes basileas su. It doesn't say tes basileas autu. So this means the Septuagint rendering recognized that it was the kingdom of you, not the kingdom of him, which is kind of interesting. The original Hebrew had, we could say the kingdom of you, or your kingdom. So that seems to correspond. NESB here, we can see them side by side. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. As a scepter of uprightness, is a scepter of your kingdom. Comparatively, KJV, thy throne, O God, is forever and ever. The scepter of thy kingdom, or the kingdom of you, the scepter of your kingdom, and the scepter of the kingdom of you. I keep swapping it back around for a reason there. So it sounds like a minor difference to most of us, but we're going to find later on that proponents to the Trinitarian view make a big deal out of this. So let's look at other what we might call non-Trinitarian versions real quick. We already looked at the REV Bible, where it talks about how that your throne is God forever and ever, right? This translation right there. This is a translation that was utilized by the biblical Unitarian crowd. And then when they come to Hebrews chapter 1, verse 8, they once again have, but of the Son it says, your throne is God forever. So they remove what we call the vocative. Let's turn into another translation by the Jehovah's Witnesses, which we know are a non-Trinitarian outfit. In the book of Psalm, they translate verse 6 here as, oops, didn't mean to highlight that. They translate it as, God is your throne forever and ever. Notice their translation is nearly identical to the biblical Unitarian, for good reason. They're going to opt for a translation that does not look like the vocative, because the vocative is the one that says, oh God. And if the writer to the book of Hebrews is addressing the Son, then it sounds too suspiciously like the writer to the book of Hebrews is saying that God is calling the Son God. But of the Son, he says, he the Father, oh God, right? Your kingdom, of God, is forever and ever, etc., etc. So the Jehovah's Witnesses are going to say, no, we don't believe Jesus is God. Therefore, we're going to opt for not the vocative, but the nominative. God is your throne forever and ever. What do they say about the book of Hebrews? Same thing. Let's bring up their translation for the book of Hebrews. Here we have it. But about the Son, he says, quote, God is your throne forever and ever, and the scepter of your kingdom is the scepter of uprightness. So again, they're removing what's known as the vocative. I'm not hanging all of my Trinitarian theology on the vocative, but I'm simply highlighting it for you, as I mentioned last week, because of the way that non-Trinitarian groups usually use that as their first point of attack. And just to be sure, notice they have the Jehovah's Witnesses have the interlinear version from the book of Hebrews. And when I scroll down to verse 8, but of the Son, or toward but the Son, pros de ton huion, the throne of you, ha thronasu, the throne of you, the God into the age of the age, and the staff of the right, straightness staff of the kingdom of him. They at least help us out by showing us that the autou is the of him, which tells me which manuscript they're pulling from. And also notice they simply say the throne of you, the throne of you. They don't tell us whether or not this is God's throne or the Son's throne, who receives his authority from God. They kind of leave it ambiguous, but just thought I'd show you what their interlinear translation. Let's jump to a non-Trinitarian translation from a Jewish perspective. Again, why am I highlighting the vocative versus the nominative? It's because when a non-Trinitarian interpreter encounters this passage in the book of Psalms or the book of Hebrews if you're Christian, one of the first things they go for is opting for the non-vocative. Because if they say vocative, then they have to explain why the translation is, "O God." Why is the writer to the book of Psalms addressing the earthly king as God? Why? How can we make sense of the Elohim? Let's begin to look at the Hebrew perspective. Remember, the book of Psalms is translated by Jewish people, but they don't care about the book of Hebrews, so we don't have to look at that. There is no book of Hebrews from a rabbinic perspective. There's only the book of Psalms. And what do they say? Thy throne given of God is forever and ever. Kisach Elohim olam ve'ed. Thy throne given of God. Why didn't they say your throne, O God? Why? Because that's the vocative. It sounds too Trinitarian, sounds too Christian. Let's get rid of the vocative. Let's instead, and remember, the original Hebrew doesn't really have a vocative in this passage. We talked about that last week as well. Thy throne given of God is forever. So this is almost like a periphrastic. They're inserting words that aren't really there, given of God. The word given there isn't there. Thy throne given of God, Kisach Elohim, your throne, Elohim, literally, the throne of you, Elohim. But they insert a verb, given of God, is forever and ever. Translating the Olam Ve'ed. A scepter of equity is the scepter of thy kingdom, Malchutecha, the kingdom of you, or your kingdom, the scepter of thy, which is the kingdom of you, your kingdom. So that's the JPS translation, the 100-year-old 1917 JPS translation. There is a modern version of the translation that shows up here. More of a modern. Is that it? Nope, that's not it. There is a more modern translation here. Let's look at Sepharia.org. They have of verse 7 here. You can see it in the middle of your screen. Your divine throne is, if I click on it, it'll do something strange to my screen, so I'm not going to click on it. But your divine throne is everlasting. Your royal scepter is a scepter of equity. So this is more of a modern JPS 1985. So they've cleaned up the language a little bit, right? They don't have the thys and thous and these and stuff anymore. But notice they also shy away from a vocative sounding first clause. Your divine throne is everlasting. The word divine throne filling in for where it has the word Elohim, Kisach Elohim. Notice also that when we're working our way through Judaic resources that are non-Christian leaning, that we also have to contend with other than JPS translations. Here's one from the Chabad.org outfit that translates right here. There we are, verse 7. Your throne, O judge, will exist forever and ever. The scepter of equity is the scepter of your kingdom. Again, non-vocative. Instead of saying your throne, O God, and instead of saying the throne that is given of you or the throne given of God or something else, they say, O judge. Now, why would they say, O judge? It's because the word Elohim in the Hebrew can be rendered as judge within context or magistrate. It doesn't always have to refer to God. We already know that judge, like Rashi, these are Rashi's comments here in the Tan section. Your throne, O judge, your throne, O prince and judge, shall exist forever and ever as the matter that is stated. Exodus 7:1, quote, I have made you a judge, Elohim, over Pharaoh, right? God speaking to Moses. And why? Because a scepter of equity is the scepter of your kingdom, that your judgments are true and you are fit to govern. So Rashi, influencing this particular translation, I'm not saying Rashi made this translation that Chabad is using, but Rashi's comments, which are in the hand part there below the translation, explain that, well, the word Elohim doesn't even have to be God, whether it's God in heaven or God below, who the writer of the book of Hebrews might be referring to Jesus. It doesn't have to be either one of those. Elohim can simply be judge. So your throne, O judge, will exist forever and ever. Why would the throne of the judge exist forever? Because it's given of God, because it's the scepter of equity and the scepter of your kingdom. So there's another perspective that we have to deal with.